Welcome to the Jaron Jarvis channel. I am Jaron Jarvis. Today, I would like to introduce to you, I recently revisited my grandpa's haunted farmhouse. My grandpa was awesome. There's just no other way of saying it, he just was awesome. I remember how, whenever we'd visit him and my grandma down in their farmhouse in Dallas, he'd gather me and my brother around a fire, crack a couple of good sticks and poke some good old pink marshmallows on them, and tell stories. Now, these weren't any of those sweet stories you see mamas telling their young ones these days. No, these were the nasty type. Anything ranging from werewolves tearing apart pregnant women to vampires sucking the blood dry from little toddlers, he'd cover it. Indulging us in countless worlds of gore and tragedy. That was Grandpa all right. As horrific as these tales would be, not many of them would actually instill fear within me, fill me with such a sense of dread that I'd install eyes on the back of my head as I walked back to my room. The ones that did get me on edge, however, were the stories he'd tell about his farmhouse. Those always seemed to be extra grisly, as if he'd sprinkle a special seasoning of horror on them. One could understand why I'd be a bit weary of them, being that I was sleeping at the same location that these horrific events took place. I'd regularly question him about this. After all, who would consciously choose to live in what looked to be a haunted farmhouse? He'd usually brush me off, giving me half answers that didn't really mean anything. However, around the time where I was approaching the age of teenhood, where my mind would grow cynical and no longer allow itself to be fooled by his tales, he gave me a different answer. We old men have our responsibilities, Jake. We can't let ourselves forget that, however bad the horrors of life may be. And my responsibilities, Jake, they lie here. He took a fat puff of his cigar, you'd never see him without one, in this old, rickety farmhouse. My home. On that day I saw a side of my grandfather I had never seen before. He was deadly serious. His wrinkled face didn't unwrinkle itself from a dark, cold gaze for the remainder of that afternoon. Whatever demons my question had reawoken, they remained sleepless right up until the old man's candle blew out. Shortly after his death my grandmother joined him. Though the circumstances surrounding her demise were significantly unsettling. At the autopsy, doctors had found that a strange infection had spread around the area of her waist, some of it right down to her groin. Her skin had turned grey and leathery, it also appeared as if it had been rotting for weeks, which was odd as the rest of the body had barely begun to show any signs of decomposition. In the end, nothing much came out of that. The doctors couldn't figure out what the infection was or where it might have come from, so we just went on with the funeral as if nothing had happened. That definitely struck an odd nerve with me. Memories of my grandfather's stories came flooding back. I spent some time, mostly out of curiosity, scanning my memories, searching for any story that had something to do with a weird, grey rotting skin disease, but my attempts fell fruitless. In light of these events I thought it'd be a good idea to revisit the famous farmhouse. A little nostalgia trip, if you will. We never managed to sell it, most of the furniture had been cleared out, and I just had an urge to get in touch with those old memories, no longer as an innocent child, but now as a broke, 25-year-old aspiring writer. I had originally intended to arrive at the farmhouse around the early hours of the afternoon, but a ruthless storm spurred out from seemingly nowhere, causing all kinds of complications which robbed me about 4 hours. The night was already falling when I pulled over next to the farmhouse. I got out and walked across the yard, stopping for a minute to admire the structure. The house was completely dark, its life drained long ago. The light from the moon failed to pierce the windows, as if stopped by a barrier of pure darkness. I nudged the door open. It screeched ajar, releasing a large coat of dust from its hinges that came together as an infant cloud. I stepped inside, greeted by the living room as if we were old friends. It was unnaturally dark inside, so I flashed my phone's light around my surroundings. The room was largely empty, as it should have been. As I dived deeper into the house, a faint chill creeped up my spine. The silence, coupled with the darkness, brought back those old stories I had heard with incredible vivacity. It left me fairly uneasy and flinching at each creak the house would often blurt out. As I explored the remainders of the top floor and the other rooms, I came upon something that struck me as strange. As I mentioned previously, the house had been completely cleared out, or at least that's what I had been told, but inside my grandparents' room on the first floor, as if trying its best to hide itself from view, was a large, wooden closet. It was resting against the wall, opposite to the door. I wandered closer to the closet, surprising myself as I noticed I had been holding my breath. I grasped the knob, reluctantly wheeling the closet door open to reveal nothing. It was empty. I let out a long breath of relief, and threw the closet doors back shut. But as I turned to leave, a small detail on the floor caught my eye. The wooden tiles had been scratched, as if someone had dragged the closet across the room. I gripped the closet's edges and pulled as strongly as I could. For a moment the closet slid smoothly, but I eventually lost my balance and the closet toppled on its side, slamming onto the floor with a thundering crash. Behind, the closet had revealed a small door that blended in with the wall, camouflaged. There was no knob, but the frame of it stuck out just enough for me to be able to thrust it open. The space within the hatch spewed out more dust than any other area in the house, forming a sort of brown mist. I scratched my nose as I entered the hatch. Inside, I saw a staircase stretching down into blackness. I wearily went on, taking each step with the care of 20. When I reached the bottom, my phone's light revealed that I was inside what looked to be a small study. A couple of shelves hung on the walls and a wooden table sat in the center of the room. The corners in which the walls and the roof met were infested with webs and cracks of old age, the paint peeling off and turning black with rot. The smell was hard to take in at first. It was like a mixture of aged milk with piss. I searched through the dilapidated shelves and came upon something rather unexpected, a small gathering of pictures held together by a paper clip. The pictures themselves appeared to have been taken almost a whole lifetime ago, with the images fading away along the edges. Each photo had a date written on the back. They were also assembled in chronological order. The first picture had Annie, 1955, etched on the back. It was a photo of a small girl. She looked to be about 3 or 4 years old. She was holding hands with a woman who I could only deduce to be grandmother in her earlier years. They stood in the middle of the park, each with goofy grins on their faces. The second had Annie, 1957. The first signs written on it. This one was taken in front of the farmhouse. My grandmother sat on the porch with the same girl in the first picture, except here the smiles weren't so lively. She held the girl on her lap, wrapping some sort of bandage around her arm. From under the bandage I was able to discern little oddities. The girl's arm seemed to have been infected, her skin looked too thick and too old, as if her arm had aged 3 times quicker than the rest of her body. The third picture only got worse. Annie, 1960. Her mind is changing. Were the words written this time? This one was taken in one of the rooms of the house, though I couldn't recognize which one. My grandmother sat on an armchair with the girl cradled in her arms. The girl was entwined in a woolen blanket and looked sick, dead, almost. One of her arms stuck out, exposing that whatever disease she had contracted had spread. The skin appeared to be seeping off her arm in a conglomerate of folds and rot. I don't have to say that this left me pretty uneasy. Though it was nothing compared to what I saw next. The last one was by far the most unnerving. On this one was written Annie, 1963. We had to isolate her. She's no longer the Annie we know. My grandmother was nowhere to be found on this one. There was, however, something. It stood at what must have been about 5 or 6 feet, but its back was slumped. It was completely naked, the skin on its back and legs droopy and sick. A black clump of dirty, chaotic hair that reached as far as its ankles rested on its head. I couldn't see its face though, which was probably a blessing, as it had its back to the camera. I couldn't believe it, but was this the same girl from the other pictures? Was she their daughter? My grandparents, or my parents, had never mentioned a daughter. Had that sickness turned her into this thing? Memories of my grandmother's autopsy quickly rushed back. It took me a few seconds before a scary realization set in. The room in which the picture had been taken was the room in which I currently stood in. But before I could act, I felt a strong pull on my leg, as if I was slipping. I looked down and noticed my foot was rested upon a thick string of black hair that tugged back with force, struggling under the pressure of my boot. As I raised my eyes, I heard a rumbling groan as a tall, slender figure stepped into the streak of light emanating from my phone. I staggered back, ready to run, but the thing propelled its huge arm in my direction, digging her sharp nails into my arm's flesh. I screamed, pounding and hammering at the thing's arm. It took slow yet long strides in my direction, making me thrash even more intensively. Finally, I managed to break free of its grasp. As it got ready to thrust its other arm forward, I dashed away from its reach and scampered up the stairs. Even with its size, the monster was unnaturally fast. It bobbed up the crooked steps with its equally crooked legs, all the while shrieking an inhuman scream that made my heart almost burst out its chest. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, praying that my car keys would work as I punched the unlock button. Thankfully, it did. Just as I jerked the door to my car shut, the creature slammed against the window, clawing ruthlessly at the glass. As I started the engine, I gazed at the thing and caught the slightest glimpse of its blue, watery eyes. It seemed that a part of Annie still lived within the confines of that rotten body. As soon as I heard the roar of the engine, I slammed the gas pedal, and watched in the rearview mirror as the silhouette of the thing grew smaller in the distance. It stood there, motionless for a moment, before darting into the surrounding fields. I drove straight home that night and spent hours in bed, unable to sleep. Whatever secrets my grandparents had, I would prefer they remained secrets. But of course, you're reading this. I'm not entirely sure what I released that night, but whatever it is, it carries a disease. The same that was found on my grandmother's corpse. I'm writing this so you know. So that you know what to do if someone you know, a friend or relative, appears one day with a strange, grey skin infection on their arm, or on their neck, or maybe it's just a little freckle on their cheek. Wherever it is, be careful. And if you live in Dallas, keep your distance from the woods, as she's still out there, our Annie. Now, I've got some business to take care of, as the skin on my left arm is growing grayer by the second.